Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. We've got Abacode and IntelliGRC here, and we are going to be going over some CMMC preparation, pitfalls, and pointers. Today, we're going to go over some practical reminders, some tips, tricks, things that we've learned over the last couple of years for CMMC preparation to help you along with your journey to get you where you need to go. Today we have Stephen and Thomas with us. Stephen, would you like to give a little introduction to yourself?
Yes. Hey, everybody. Yeah, Stephen Molter here again with IntelliGRC. I'm one of our internal lead consultants for mainly for CMMC efforts, NIST-based focuses, FedRAMP, RMF. We kind of dabble in it all. As anybody who knows us well knows that we are kind of entrenched in that. And then I support our internal efforts to kind of govern the implementation and application of new features and things like that into the IntelliGRC SaaS application or GRC platform, because we want the GRC platform to solve pain points that we ourselves have experienced. So that's kind of part of what we're working on. I love working with people. I love educating. Part of my main role here at IntelliGRC is we have projects, training projects where an MSP or an OSC will sign up with us, and we'll kind of take them through the gambit of how to prepare for CMMC. A lot of training, a lot of classroom style one-on-ones, things like that. And that's my heart. I love teaching people, love helping people understand the requirements, and then kind of sending them off and after having taught them to fish. So, yeah, that's a little bit about me. And then just by way of introduction for IntelliGRC, again, I mentioned we are a GRC platform. We do have, like I said, a service offering that I'm kind of involved in. My team is involved in. But we are striving to be an intelligent GRC platform that stands out for our ability to really make life a little easier for these GRC efforts. It's never going to be 100% easy. It's never going to be perfect. But we have taken some of the pain that we've experienced as practitioners. We've applied some of the best practices from automation, AI usage, the ability to write implementation statements based on the data points that it sees. All those fun things that we're really introducing and honing our skills in and introducing into the app. So keep a lookout for our release notes, things like that. And that's a little bit about us at Intelli.
Awesome. Thank you. Thomas?
Yeah, good afternoon. Thanks, Jared. Good to be with you here, Stephen, today. Tomas Idinge, Vice President of Operations at Abacode Cybersecurity and Compliance. I run our professional services group, which includes our compliance readiness offerings. We work across multiple compliance frameworks, helping clients get ready for their audits or assessments or certifications. When we work with clients who are getting ready for CMMC, then we leverage the IntelliGRC platform to help both our team and our client. And we certainly have seen in practice some of the things Stephen mentioned about the tool, and love seeing some of the recent automation features that I think fits the intelligent component that you have in your name, Stephen. So we'll give you some props there. But yeah, so who's Abacode? Like I said, we provide cybersecurity and compliance solutions. So we'll do 24/7 monitoring of our clients' environments. We'll provide penetration testing, vulnerability management, support. We'll do managed training. And then our GRC offering, where again, we provide a readiness service for our clients, where we take them through sort of a full program of being assessed, and then kind of standing up the program, leveraging one of the GRC portals, and then making sure we help you all the way through and beyond your audits or assessments. Since compliance is not a one-time thing, you got to get there, and then you got to stay there.
That's right.
So we work with our clients sort of on a long-term basis. But yeah, it's a little bit about Abacode.
Can I just interject here, Jared? I will just speaking personally about Abacode, they give us a good word, so I'm going to give them a good word. I've sat in on
I knew that's
assessments
what you were
where,
going to do.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. You knew that. I sat in on assessments where I represented an OSC that uses Abacode as their MSSP, their SIEM/SOC 24/7 and vulnerability management. And the guy that they had sitting in on the assessment, I think his name was Robert, absolutely dominated. It was awesome. Like he was so ready for every single question about any query that they wanted to see of certain logs and tables. So just interjecting here, Abacode knows what they're doing. I love them. I can't recommend them enough.
We'll have some time later, so you can just
Oh
continue on
yeah,
that story
hugs,
and
maybe a little bit of
continue the
hugs.
compliments. Thank you very much, both of you. Before we go forward, my name's Jared. I also work at Abacode. I'm a demand generation manager, and I'm going to be moderating this webinar. But yeah, so what we're going to be covering today, there is a lot of news over the last couple months, over the last 24 hours, about CMMC, specifically 48 CFR. So we're going to dig into that a little bit. Stephen's going to kind of run you through that and the significance of that, and also some of the other things that have happened probably over the last 6 months. We will talk about scoping methodology, tips and tricks. It's a very huge part of the CMMC process. It's where things can go right and wrong. And then we will talk about the pitfalls and how to overcome them from the experience from both of our companies for getting people prepared for CMMC and getting through C3PAO assessments. And then just practical preparation pointers that we think are going to be important for you to get you where you need to go in the CMMC process. So with that being said, 48 CFR was published to the Federal Register today. That is huge news. Stephen, would you like to tell everyone why that's huge news, why it's significant, and what that means for CMMC?
Yes, I spent the better portion of my day yesterday reading through the 84 page public inspection version. Obviously, today was when it was actually posted to the register. Yeah, that was a fun read. It was really good. And this is a big deal. Fundamentally, this is the rule um, that sets the ecosystem up for actually having contractual requirements. And we had, back last year, the publication of the 32 CFR final rule. That was, the government's way of telling us what the requirements were going to be in a codified format. This is the rule that actually says, okay, now that you know the requirements, now they're actually requirements in the contracts. And it sets up the stipulations for all those things. And there's some awesome things about this rule. I think like pretty fundamental things that they needed to do. One of the requirements that is really interesting is they are setting the onus on the contracting officer to actually tell you what CMMC level and what type of CMMC assessment versus whether it's a self-assessment or an actual C3PAO assessment is going to be required as part of the contract. It's not going to be, shooting from the hip, determining certain things. Because one of the things you guys may remember from when the final rule was published is that there's some variance in the way that contract requirements are conveyed to the contractors. So if it's like a CMMC level 3 contract for a prime, not all the subcontracts are going to require level 3. In fact, it says several times throughout the 32 CFR that it's the minimum is level 2 C3PAO assessments. So what's going to be good is this just tells us there's going to be plain English. Contracting officer is going to be responsible for conveying exactly the level that's required for the contract. We kind of assumed that was going to happen, but we didn't have that in writing anywhere until this was written. It also talks about some consistency things between the 48 CFR proposed rule and the final rule being updated to really align with the 32 CFR. So talking about things like using the term affirming official over the whatever it was senior official beforehand. So they're really trying to make sure that this is not as confusing as it could be. Talking about like the 180-day POAMs and the ability to be awarded a contract if you have that conditional certification with that 180-day poem. So that was really good to see. Um, there are some other interesting ones. Jeremy, you and I were talking about it a little bit earlier, where there's the total removal of the requirement for a contractor to update the contracting officer or the up the tier of any quote unquote changes to their information system or status with compliance, because and they say based on public comment, so there you go. There's evidence that your comments work. It's good to put in comments, but based on those public comments, they deemed that the incident reporting responsibilities for contractors under DFAR 7012 and the annual affirmations were sufficient to protect the DoD's data. So there's a little bit of credit being given to OSCs, and I think one of the reasons is they haven't defined what a change that would be significant enough to require a reassessment. They haven't defined that anywhere. They've kind of just said significant enough. Well, tell me what that means, Mr. Government. So anyway, those are some of the big ones. I have a TLDR, and maybe we can get into some of the more finer points later on. But for the sake of time, those are some of the big changes. Other than what you see here on the screen, we're talking about around November 10th is what people are estimating. It actually could be sooner because of the impact of this requirement. It could be sooner, but whenever that effective date is, it is going to kick off phase 1 of the CMMC phase rollout, which means that level 1, which are all self-assessments, and level 2 self-assessments, which is a small minority of the level 2, but they are possible, they are real. Some say in the DIB that's not a thing, but they are. I've worked on contracts that have handled CUI data as part of a DoD contract that did not fall under that defense organizational index grouping on NARA's website. So they do exist, but the vast majority of them are going to have the C3PO assessment requirements. But for this first phase, it's going to be all the self-assessments, level 1 and level 2. And then, as everybody knows, and as guys like James Galooly have made very clear, and I really appreciate him saying this, the DoD does still reserve the right to incorporate requirements earlier than what the phased rollout may stipulate. So that's a quick update on the 48 CFR. Jared, you want to go to the next slide?
Yeah, before we do that, I forgot to mention, there will be about 5-10 minutes at the end
For
of this
Q&A,
webinar
right.
for Q&A. Q&A is open, so if you have questions, please put them in there, and we will answer them to the best of our ability at the end.
No. Right. So by way of quickly updating everyone on some of the other major CMMC things, and then Thomas, I actually want to get your thoughts on some of this stuff. If you guys missed the most recent town hall, had some pretty cool numbers. About 80 C3PAOs are now ready to actually start doing these assessments, and so with the phase 1 kicking off, it's really good to see. I mean, obviously, we wish we had more. There's a ratio difference there, obviously. But there have been a total of 270-ish final certifications issued, which, having that many certification issues prior to the rule being actually codified and put in the register is actually pretty incredible. It's a pretty good number, and hopefully that will help with the bandwidth for these C3PAOs for the ones that are coming in more last minute. There was a class deviation for that confusing time over the last couple of months where people were pointing to the CMMC 1.0 language, saying that it's October 1st. Now, again, if the full 60-day congressional review occurs, that's not a possibility now, right? It's going to be November. But that date was codified in rulemaking, so it was very confusing because it was still live, but that was a holdover from the CMMC 1.0 days. So that was nixed. The memo clearly said that's not to be included into the contract until until necessary, right? Which we now have the 48 CFR, which will set when that is necessary and has set when that is necessary. I do want to remind everyone about some of the other memos that may have gotten missed. And then Thomas, I want to see what you're seeing in the industry in relationship to all these memos. There is still the requirement to understand FedRAMP moderate equivalency in light of the memo that was released related to that. So I've seen a couple things in the industry, and again, Thomas, I want to get your thoughts. I've seen a couple things in the industry that is where people are articulating equivalency, but there are poems for certain requirements that they have and whatnot. And that's definitionally per this memo, not equivalency. Thomas, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think we've seen some of our clients using, cloud-based systems that claim either that they are FedRAMP moderate, for example, but they're not in the marketplace, so that's an easy. Well, you're not, but then they claim equivalency, and a couple of times where we've had to press on them. Well, then provide us with the evidence, all the evidence that say you are, and some of them have struggled, right? So there's a little bit of marketing and so forth going on, where maybe they're a little bit ahead in their messaging from where they actually are. So I would just, it's a good caution flag to make sure your cloud-based solutions that state that can actually provide it. The safe way is to make sure somebody is actually in the marketplace, the FedRAMP marketplace. But there are many others that are working towards it, and some that I think probably are equivalent and can demonstrate it. But yeah, a bit of a caution flag there for sure. We've seen a couple of clients of ours had to make some very late changes, big changes as they were pursuing, their certifications. It costs a lot of heartache.
100%. Yeah, we've kind of seen some of the same things, just maybe not like lying, but not so clear advertising to where it's better safe than sorry.
Yeah.
Just reminder, we're still in Rev 2, 800-171 Rev 2. That class deviation is still in place. It will take further rulemaking or another major memo for that to change. So it would be a big deal. And then the level determinations memo, I mentioned earlier that the self-assessment versus certification assessment that was put out as guidance for being all predicated on the type of data that's being stored, processed, and transmitted by the contractor. So just quick reminders. I know, but I want to be cognizant of everyone's time to get through all the content. So one final note here from the AB is there was a major change to the Tier 3 process that involves not so fun effort that has to get done. So there's some new packages that have to be uploaded by people to retain that Tier 3 and for this new continuous vetting aspect for CCAs and CCPs. So just keep in mind that may be impacting some bandwidth of people being able to assist you, or you very well may be a CCA, CCP. That's an effort that you guys need to consider and make sure we get taken care of. I'm in the same boat, so we're all there. But I think that's a good wrap up for some of the updates just before we get into the actual content. Jared? All right. So Thomas and I wanted to spend some time trying to help and guide, shepherd you guys on some of the nuances relating to scoping that, based on our experience, we see some struggle with. And so we wanted to do a little bit of a refresher. So by way of quick review, there's a major difference between level 1 and level 2 scoping. Everybody kind of knows that. Level 1 is all predicated on where is FCI, federal contracting information, stored, processed, and transmitted. And it pretty much explicitly limits everything to that idea. It's the direct storage, the direct process, and the direct transmission of that data on organizational assets. Level 2 scoping is much different. That picture on the right shows there's a definite increase in the effort and the complexity that comes with scoping a level 2 environment. Thomas, you want to give us some feedback on that difference?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are a couple of thoughts high level before getting into some of your good details to follow here. But just to quantify what Stephen just said, right? Level 1 is basically 15 security requirements you need to meet, right? Level 2 goes to 110, which you can then multiply a little bit by 2 to 3 to get over 300 actual control objectives that you need to meet. So getting that right has a huge impact on the effort that follows. The other high level scoping thing we talk to our clients about a lot, and it'll get into a little bit of your, I think, scoping strategy as well. But is the entire business working with CUI, for example, right? Or is the government / DoD practice a component of the bigger business that may help you decide, do I have my entire organization in scope, right, for the assessment, or do I create, right, what we call an enclave, right, or a smaller contained separate environment, right, where a CUI is stored and processed, and then only provide access to people who really need to handle the CUI. We often have those conversations up front. There's pros and cons. I think we'll touch on it a little bit later. A lot of times, the smaller that environment, you can keep it, the easier it probably is to get it all right. But at the same time, operationally, you may create, things where people now have to operate in two environments, right? Maybe a sort of a government and a commercial environment within the organization. So some pros and cons there at a high level to think about sort of before diving in.
Yeah. So just a quick review of the categories, and this is kind of fundamental to scoping, is there are 4 categories of assets in CMMC. And it's really important to understand them, because how you categorize your stuff leads to how you treat your stuff. So the 4 being, there's a CUI asset. It's a pretty obvious one. There's a security protection asset. There's a customer or contractor risk managed asset, and then there's specialized assets. So what's really interesting about each of these categories of asset, which I'll explain each of them in a moment, is one thing you'll notice is the treatment under the final rule of the 32 CFR and the associated scoping and assessment guides. The treatment of them and the obligation by a DIB contractor, an OSA or OC, is pretty much the same. It used to not be written that way, but it's pretty much the same. So a CUI asset being any system components that directly store, process, and transmit CUI. Think of that file server or SharePoint, or think of the local laptops that your users are issued where they need to edit that PDF that is marked as CUI, right? Those are storing, processing, even transmitting CUI, and those need to be considered CUI assets. The requirement for those assets, and I know everybody can read, but I want to just make it practical. The requirements for that asset is, it needs to be inventoried. It needs to show up in something more than just, Active Directory. It needs to be inventoried. It needs to be talked about. And when you're writing your SSP's implementation statements for how you're meeting the requirements and how you're implementing the requirements as part of your plan to secure the system, hence the SSP, the system security plan, it needs to be talked about. It needs to be addressed. And then it needs to be represented on your diagram. That's a fundamental part of your scoping artifact and conveying to an assessor and to your internal team. Because remember, the SSP is not for your assessor. The SSP is for your internal team to know how the system is to be secured. So part of that conveying what the SSP is referring to is having a fundamental network or system diagram that shows those types of assets. So all your CUI assets need to at least be represented on that diagram. And then finally, you need to prepare those assets to be assessed against all the CMMC level 2 requirements, obviously as applicable. You're not going to give a background check to a file server, but you get what I'm saying. And then the expectation is that when a C3PO's assessment team comes in, they're going to sample your system against the requirements that apply to them. And the CUI assets are going to be the prime movers of that assessment. They're going to be making sure that those CUI assets are protected in accordance with NIST 800-171 Rev 2. And then we move on to security protection assets. And these are assets that they don't store, process, and transmit CUI necessarily, but they provide the security functions or capabilities to other assets in the scope for the system. So you're thinking of those SIM SOC services, right? You're thinking of your vulnerability management server, your Nessus on-prem scanner, if you have one of those, or if you have a cloud vulnerability scanner, right? Those interconnections like Abacode would be a security protection asset cloud external service provider, right? Or not a cloud, but an external service provider. That would be the way that you would view these system components and assets in your system. And they simply by virtue of them providing those functions to your system. And the requirements, if you notice from the screenshot of the scoping guide on the right, the requirements are exactly the same. Exactly the same. There's no difference in the wording here, right? You are required to implement all the requirements. They need to show up in your inventory. They need to be documented in your SSP when you're talking about your implementation statements, and they need to be represented on your network diagram. Now, the big difference here, though, is that when you're getting your assessment performed by a C3PO, they're going to be vetting those assets against the requirements that have something to do with the capabilities they provide. So, for example, when you get to the requirement for, I don't know, AU L2339, which is the subset of privileged users for security for audit logging functionality. They're going to be making sure that your SIM provider has some access controls to make sure that only that subset of privileged users are able to get in there. They're going to be vetting requirements particularly related to the services or functions they provide as a security protection asset. They're not going to be checking every single requirement like they would in general for a CUI asset. Does that make sense? And then this contractor risk managed asset, this is one we actually have seen a lot less of as of recent, especially with the clarification of what an external service provider is. But these are assets that could potentially have access or store, process, and transmit CUI. But because of mitigatory policies, procedures, and technical capabilities, configurations, things like that they put in place, they're not supposed to. And they're kind of in the same room with it, if you will, with CUI, as you will. So you think of that HR person who doesn't do any contract work, but works in the same file server as somebody else, or works in the same building where CUI is printed and put on people's desks before it's locked away, right? Those people may be considered CRMAs. Or one common example is their workstations. They are on the same networks as maybe the other workstations where CUI may be processed, but their machines, by virtue of them not having a role in a contract, their machines may never have CUI on them, but because they have potential access to the file server or to whatever asset to store, process, and transmit that CUI, they're considered contractor risk managed assets. And the requirements for them, again, are exactly the same. The obligations on the OSA is exactly the same. The main difference here, and it's a big difference, is the assessors are not really going to be looking at them very much. They're going to make sure that they're talked about in the SSP and dealt with. They have mitigatory things in place. And if they are concerned about something, they'll dig a little deeper into it. But to be frank, I've never really seen that happen other than one time dealing with BYOD devices. That's the only time that I've seen them dig deeply into a CRMA. And then specialized asset, just to wrap up, these are assets that don't have the potential because of functionality or some other, by virtue of the nature of the asset, it can't be fully secured in alignment with the requirements. So think of something that doesn't really have an operating system that has the ability to implement a device lock for an activity or something like that. Things like those testing equipment, CNC routers, things like that, that might have, CUI blueprints uploaded from a flash drive or something like that to perform a job. Those are assets, but they're not the same type of assets that you would think of implementing a device or something, a device lock or something like that on. So the requirements for these are very similar. You're to be documenting them in inventory. You make sure you're talking about them in your SSP, any mitigations and policies that you put in place to cover the risks related to them, you're addressing them. But there's no requirement to implement the other CMMC requirements on them. And the assessor's job here is to make sure that they're talked about in the SSP and dealt with, and then do nothing else. That's literally what it says, is do not assess against other CMMC relevant requirements. So that's just I know that took a little bit of time, but that's a general overview of the scoping assets and obligations based on what is scoped, so that you are, again, reminded and refreshed on what the obligations are going to be. So, Thomas, did you have anything you wanted to add to the asset categories?
Yeah, maybe a little bit. I think, on the security protection assets, I think that's you got to figure out
Big
sort of
one.
what's applicable and relevant in terms of the requirements. But if we think back about a year, I think, to the early first version of the final rule, where there was talk about like any sort of, external service provider needed to be fully compliant themselves, sort of across the board. That caused a lot of conversation, and then I think luckily it went in this direction where let's focus on what's relevant in what that service provider is doing and what assets they are managing on your behalf.
Yeah.
But I think the concept of the external service providers is important. It's important to really understand what does the service provider do fully on your behalf, what is a shared responsibility, and what do you still as the organization need to do. When we provide back to our sort of 24/7 security operations center monitoring service, we provide our clients with a shared responsibility matrix that outlines exactly that, and that's something you shouldn't be afraid to ask of your service providers.
Exactly. Yeah, that's really good. And that kind of leads me into what I think the strategy for scoping should be, because you hit on, as a security protection asset, there's still a data element to this, especially under the final rule. It was introduced under the proposed rule. But what we teach at IntelliGRC, as probably the fundamentally the most efficient way, and I think, Thomas, you and I have a lot of synchronicity on this, is we teach having a data-based approach to scoping. It all starts with identifying what data you're getting, where the data is going in your environment, who's handling it, where is it going when it's no longer needed, how is it destroyed when it's no longer needed, what system components internally and cloud-based, external service provider-based will it be stored on when it's at rest. All those kind of questions that you're brainstorming and digging through with your contracting officers and your PMs and things like that, to kind of get an idea of the data flow. And that sets up the fundamental information for you to build out your data flow, and then the associated governing enforcement policies for controlling that data flow. But once you have those things in place, we really do teach that should direct the scoping conversation. Because once you know where data, especially CUI data, is allowed to go, right? That's when you know what is going to be directly storing, processing, and transmitting that data. And therefore, you've identified your CUI assets. The other category of data that I think you were alluding to big time, Thomas, was there's this concept that was introduced in the proposed rule for the 32 CFR Part 170, and then when we have the final rule codifying it, called security protection data. It's everybody knows about this now if you've been paying attention at all, and there's been some debates in the community about its implications, and does it have similar implications to bringing things in scope like CUI does? I argue yes, based on the language of like the CMMC scoping guide, where the screenshot came from, that you have a similar conversation about where do vulnerability scan results go? Where do logs go? Where do credentials used to access the system go? Where does security relevant technical data flow throughout the environment? And that, I think, by virtue of the language of the scoping guide and other elements of the 32 CFR, that also helps implicate what's going to be considered as a security protection asset, not just, what functions do they provide, even though that's what's kind of outlined in the scoping guide, but also where does security protection data go? If you're sending vulnerability scan results to some random cloud storage provider, that could be a problem, right? That could be a big problem. Do you agree, Thomas?
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And it's again back to thinking about like when we work with our clients, right? We have it like if we provide vulnerability management services. So where does it live when we work with it, and then where does it live in the client's environment? Totally.
Yeah, I totally agree. There's and there you have that question of, okay, now that I've played it safe than sorry, and if there's going to be data being sent somewhere that is relevant to the security of the system, that if it were to be compromised, that could lead to actual further compromise to actual CUI. That's one of the principles that we use and think through how we're thinking through it. So if that's the case, now we got to treat this thing as a security protection asset, apply the 800-171 requirements to it, and you know be ready to be assessed on that in that context. So yeah, that's the perspective that we teach. It's not abundantly clear, and there are people, good faith people, who disagree on this topic, but that's where we stand.
Yeah, I think when we chatted about this, Stephen, too, is we do the same, right? Meaning if there's any doubt, go the safe route, even if it's slightly more cumbersome, perhaps. But we're not going to advise anyone to interpret it a little bit the way they want because it's more convenient. You'll be much happier in the end by taking
Right.
the more risk averse and stronger security posture path in all these cases.
Yeah, 100% agree. So I guess the implications then, that has been a big part of the conversation, is, okay, how does this impact, and you kind of brought it up and mentioned it, how does this impact external service providers? So I guess for the sake of time, just to breeze through what the current requirements are for these different situations and how they're scoped in. CSPs, cloud service providers, right? They're external service provider is an umbrella term for any external system that provides some type of IT or related services, especially ones that store, process, and transmit CUI on behalf of the customer or security protection data. So CSPs, cloud service providers, if they are storing, processing, or transmitting CUI, you can get this right from the 32 CFR. It's, I think, part 170.19. There's a table in there that outlines this. Cloud service providers have to be FedRAMP moderate equivalent, or obviously an actual ATO is accepted if it's going to store, process, and transmit CUI. If it doesn't store, process, and transmit CUI, but it stores, processes, and transmits security protection data, logs, vulnerability scans, think of IT glue, those credentials being used to access the system, whatever the case may be. It does not need to be FedRAMP. Let's make that abundantly clear right now, because that's another common misconception in the industry. It does not need to be FedRAMP, but you do have to get a CRM from them, and you do have to be prepared to apply the 800-171 requirements to them and have an assessor vet the implementation of those requirements that are relevant to the security services they provide. Okay. Managed service providers, they are likewise required to, if they store, process, and transmit CUI, they are required to have the 800-171 requirements applied to the portions of their system that store, process, and transmit that data, and they will be part of what is assessed when the customers that handed them that data go for their assessment. So they're treated as a CUI the same. So that's why it's really important to have a representative from the MSP show up, be ready to answer questions, to share their screen, to provide artifacts, things like that, because the assessor has every obligation to vet them too. If they don't store, process, and transmit CUI, but store, process, and transmit security protection data, or they provide a security service or function to the OSC, they're treated as security protection assets. So they need to apply the 800-171 requirements to the portion of their system that's storing, processing, and transmitting that data or providing those functions. But they're only going to be assessed and questioned and vetted by the C3PAO in accordance with the services they provide as they go along with those certain requirements. And I'm sure, and the same thing goes for MSSPs. It's the same context. So Thomas, you guys have seen this over and over and over again, I'm sure by now.
Yeah, absolutely. And whether we've, guided a client sort of through their assessment, or, we participated because we provided the client with a service.
Right.
The one thing I would add here is it's still important that you, as the organization being assessed, demonstrate your knowledge of these roles and responsibilities, and and don't just rely 100% on your service providers to kind of cover everything for you, right? That's ultimately, you're still accountable. They're providing a service for you, and we've seen many cases where that doesn't come across, and it doesn't look so good to the auditors. Not that has a check mark on it, right? With a yes or no. They seem to know what their service providers do, right? That's not an audit question, but it's certainly, if the auditor feels like you don't, they'll dig in some more, most likely.
100%. Yeah, that's a motto over here at IntelliGRC is let's do things that make the assessors ask less questions rather than more. So 100%. All right, for sake of time, let's move on to the next slide, Jared. So Thomas and I talked, and we think that these were some common ones that we could at least touch base on, especially for people getting started in their implementation, or maybe are already underway, but some things to watch out for, some pitfalls. I gave a talk at CMMC Day on the access control requirements, to start with the first one, that are commonly misunderstood. Things like the very first control, AC L23.1.1, which is the requirement to identify authorized users, processes acting on behalf of users and devices, and then limit system access to just those things. It is incredible how often somebody without any, HR platform, CRM, tie-in approval process will, as we're trying to get them ready, or they're talking through this control, that they will immediately bring up Active Directory or Enter ID and say, there you go, there's my authorized users identified. And, again, this is one that there is some disagreement in the industry, but it is generally well understood that that is not definitionally an authorized user list. How do you know that some IT admin didn't roguely go and create a user account or add a PC object that shouldn't be there, right? Without an authorization process that each object has to tie back to. So this is one example of, it is really important. And one of the common pitfalls is it's really important for people to understand the requirements that they have to apply, right? If you don't understand the requirement, how shooting from the hip is not going to be beneficial for you when you go into your assessment. And that's one thing that I wanted to touch on. Thomas, what are your thoughts on that?
I couldn't agree more, but I will, companies like us that help with this, right? That's one of our jobs, is to help you understand what is the requirement, what does it mean, what's the spirit of it, right? Because it's not there's oftentimes more than one way to meet a requirement, but you need to understand the spirit of it and what they're really asking. So totally agree. And that can be applied probably to a bunch of them. But since I have the mic, I'll jump all the way down kind of to this whole, it's an IT thing, right? It really isn't. It's a business endeavor, right? It impacts the business. That's why you're going after this in the first place. You're gonna do business with the DoD or be a subcontractor, and you're gonna make money doing so, hopefully. And this should be considered when you go about this journey. Probably a little bit of cost benefit analysis is good.
Right.
But if that all checks, then making sure that that leadership buy-in is there is huge. And then not assuming that one network engineer or one IT manager is going to sort of carry this for you all the way through. It takes more than that. It takes definitely a buy-in from the whole business.
Absolutely.
You'll see change, right? There's any big program comes with change. So just simple organizational change enablement around this. Let's say you create an enclave for your environment to house and process CUI. People's jobs probably will change, what they need to do day to day, right? So there's a big education, training, communication, enablement component there that, I mean, frankly, it's often missing in many IT projects, and this one's no different. But sort of again, it's not an IT project, right? It should be viewed as a business program, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Totally agree. I think for sake of time, one of the other ones that I want to mention, so I appreciate you jumping down to that one because I did want to cover that one. C3PAO choice. We're getting to the point where there's enough, obviously 270 certifications have been issued. We're getting to the point where there's some reputations getting built. Now we have partnerships with certain C3POs that we recommend because we know their methodology, we trust their judgment, they're reliable, they're honest. But this ecosystem is getting to be big, and it's getting to be pretty. It's flowering into a lot of providers, and 80 C3PAOs doesn't seem like much, but it's getting to the point where they're starting to develop a reputation. And our recommendation is, and this is based on experience, is really talk and spend time and vet the C3POs, talk to other people, get testimonials, things like that. Because one thing you don't want to have happen, and we've seen this, is you wind up with, say, the, for lack of a better term, the cheapest C3PAO assessment, and find out that they have a totally different perspective on certain requirements than the majority opinion or the what your assessors what your consultants have guided you on. They can't consult you, but you can ask questions, you can set expectations, and you can glean their disposition on certain things as you're getting introduced to them and starting that project. So I can't emphasize enough, just like, the bullet before, I think we covered it, so I didn't touch on it again, but just like it's really important to vet your MSPs, MSSPs, Thomas touched on this, make them provide the proof and things like that. It's really important to set yourself up for success for your actual assessment. Go with people that are reputable, go with people that have, they're not just going to pass you for the sake of passing you, but they're known to be good assessors, is the long and short of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead,
Yeah,
Thomas.
I think you should look at this like you assess any vendor, right? You should do the same here and do the right due diligence when you make this choice. And they all are ending up with some backlogs as well now. So make sure you do this early enough in the process,
Right.
So you have time, because otherwise you may find yourself at I really like this, but they have a backlog of X months, and I can get with this other one cheaper and quicker. So start that process early. Give yourself enough time to really vet them and get comfortable with the timelines.
Totally agree. You want to move on to the next one, Jared?
Yeah, I was gonna just Are we out of? Yeah, never mind. I'm with you, Stephen. We're out of time almost.
Almost. I just want to touch on this last kind of consultative slide. So really quickly, you already touched on it, Thomas. Let's move quickly. You don't have time anymore. The 48 CFR is here. We've got an effective date coming up shortly. We don't have time anymore. Move forward now. Be realistic. It's a lot of work, but it's better to acknowledge that now and set up at the expectation for the resource allotment for it. If you've not started, start now. It's a lot of work, but get ready to go. And there's a billion ways that you can make your life easier. I'm not here to pitch and tell you or anything, but there's several things. And getting outside help is one of the things on our slide. It's really important that if you are in a time crunch, not to underestimate what goes into this. So, acknowledge that. Let's move forward. I am a big proponent, after having worked with several MSP clients and OSC clients and working with them and representing them during their assessments and things like that. I've seen it time and time again that the success rate of a company that puts together a team of people to work on this rather than putting it all on one person's shoulders, it's a night and day difference. Thomas alluded to this earlier. It is very unfortunate when we see the assumption that we can just put this all on one guy's shoulders, one girl's shoulders, and just expect them to perform. A lot of them do, but it is burnout central. So all I'm trying to convey here is I would really recommend that as part of that acknowledging of how much work it is, prepare a resource allocation that allows a team to be put together rather than one person. I know that that's tough for small businesses, but if it is an option, I can't recommend it enough to do that. Thomas, you want to talk about choosing external service providers?
Yeah, I mean, I'll add on a little bit on some feedback we've heard from some of the C3PAOs we work with the most. One of the toughest thing for them is to schedule out all this work, and like I said, they're starting to have some backlogs. So one of their biggest problems at the moment is they'll start an assessment and then very quickly realize that organization actually isn't ready for the assessment yet, right? The company thought so. Auditors very quickly realize you're not. And of those cases, many of those, a big percentage of those, are where the company has tried to go at it alone, right? Versus getting some type of outside expert help along the way to get ready. So a little more evidence on that from the actual assessors, not just from us as service providers. But yeah, in terms of choosing those service providers, I mentioned, do you have that customer responsibility matrix or CRM for the applicable services? Like I mentioned, if we provide monitoring services for our clients, again, vetting service providers the way you would vet anyone, and then re-emphasizing that cloud service provider, right? Making sure they truly are FedRAMP moderate or equivalent and can really demonstrate that. And the willingness to commit and show up for your assessment. Yeah, I think
That's huge.
Yeah, there's a balance there. We have part of our service where we help the client through the final assessment. Obviously, kind of have to stay independent from the C3PAOs there. We're no longer sort of assessors. We're guiding and helping our clients provide the proper evidence and materials and documentation, and help them prepare for answering questions and demonstrating things. But that can certainly be a good indicator if a company is willing to do that or not.
Yep. One other, for sake of time, one other point is there's a practical element as you're preparing, as you're working through things. I really do think delegation is big. That kind of goes back to, building a team of people, but also, you want to implement every requirement in good faith, but prioritize the requirements, read the 32 CFR about the requirements for this, but you want to prioritize the requirements that are not eligible for 180-day POAM. So all of those non-one pointers, with the exception of the FIPS requirement, there's even certain one pointers that aren't eligible. Make sure you're implementing as much as you can. So just think about being strategic, if especially if you're on a crunch for time, starting with those most significant 5-pointer, 3-pointers, getting them all kind of crushed, and the few 1-pointers that are not eligible for POAM. So I think what would probably be good is if we just moved on directly. We'll send the slide deck out, I think, to all the registrants so that you guys can see the key takeaways. But are there any questions for the last 5 minutes?
Yeah, so we do have a couple questions here. One of them was about Abacode being an SAP, I believe, and I think we kind of dove into that after it was asked in terms of why that might happen. One of them is one of our departments wants to use a cloud service provider for creating trainings. This would be accessed from their laptop, which would be considered a CUI asset, as they do work with CUI. They would not be putting CUI in the CSP for creating trainings. Does the CSP need to be FedRAMP moderate since it's going to be accessed via a CUI asset?
No. So the requirement for the implication of a cloud service provider, or any asset for that matter, being considered a CUI asset, and therefore having the FedRAMP requirements if it's a CSP and stuff like that, is by virtue of, does actual CUI data get transmitted, stored, and processed by that product or by that asset. So no, the answer to that would be in some assessors' opinions, certain CSPs that don't store, process, or transmit CUI or SPA at all, the 32 CFR says they're not even an external service provider for the system. Some assessors are just like, yeah, they're just another piece of approved software. It just happens to be cloud-based. So if there's no SPD, if there's no CUI going there, then it's not even an external service provider. Neither of the requirement sets for external service providers, CUI, SPA, or SPD related requirements would apply to that.
Okay. After telling my superior about phase 1 of CMMC, they are assuming that just means that they have an extra year to get this done. How do I convince her otherwise?
Tell them they're wrong. Thomas, do you have a thought? I mean, I can give you mine.
Yeah, I was unsuccessful technically to post a picture of the phases from the DoD, right? And it tells you the phase 1 and 2, but underneath it all, it says sort of still at the discretion of the DoD, right? So I think that's part of the answer. There's no guarantee that you won't have the requirements sooner, right?
Right.
On what it
says. And this is one of the biggest differences between the before and after of the 48 CFR being effective. Is before the 48 CFR, we still have DFAR 7012, 7019, 7020, 7024. Many people don't talk about 7024, but those have all been in place for a while now, right? But the difference now is, instead of just being a regular self-assessment, self-attestation, now there's some teeth where the person who is considered the affirming official, right? They have a lot of responsibility. That person there's some teeth to this thing that wasn't there before. I mean, obviously the government could exercise. I had it on the slide. We just didn't have time to go over it. The government could exercise a False Claims Act. Somebody could perform a KITAM lawsuit and get the Department of Justice involved, and there could be a big mess for them still. But now we also have this element where there's another person that's been called out as, being directly, liable for some of the things that they claim is going on. So the requirements are still there. The CMMC requirements are still going to be showing up on contracts. It just so happens that the best case scenario is that they may not need an actual certification until phase 2. They still need to meet the CMMC level 2 requirements, and they need to be able to attest to that and self-assess and meet their DFAR 7019 requirements. So I think it's just head in the sand kind of thought process, but I'm trying to be kind.
Yeah, I
All right.
agree, and I think there's some things to think about, right? That may help in the what are some triggers? Like, are you number one, know your contracts, understand do they have CUI now, or are you pursuing ones in the future that will have CUI? When do they expire, right? When are they going to be renewed? Were you just awarded a big new CUI contract? Maybe you are slightly at high risk for an actual assessment coming your way without
Yeah.
you scheduling it because you have a big new contract. Maybe so, right? Versus other scenarios. So just really having a knowledge of your contract sort of landscape is important.
Yeah. Jared, I know we're getting out of time, but those two questions there I think are really good if we can try to cram them in.
Yep. So I've got three. So
The oldest two.
the oldest two. So is the what do you think the biggest actions one can take to optimize time during assessment prep?
Yeah, so just really quick one-liner advice. Identify who's going to be responsible for answering certain questions during the assessment, who's going to be responsible for the controls and objectives, and have a cheat sheet of what you're going to do. If we're talking about assessment prep, if we're talking about like actually preparing for the week of assessment, that has been super successful. If you're talking just in general about implementing the requirements, I mean, having a solid POAM and a really, really constructively critical assessment, like gap assessment from somebody to tell you the hard, honest truth about how much you have left to do is really important because it sets you up for success to do exactly what you need to do to get ready. I mean, there's a million things I could say, but those are a couple things.
Okay, and then how much detail should we provide in network diagrams for an assessment? Should we include VLANs, cloud workloads, and MFA enforcement points?
So, Thomas, I'll let you have the last word on this one. Normally, the network diagrams that assessors use and want to see is network system diagram that we talk about being in your system security plan are pretty happy with them being pretty vague. As long as they represent the assets themselves, including cloud assets, right? Cloud workloads. You mentioned cloud workloads. You could simply say Azure and maybe have like a little icon showing like a VM if you're running VMs in Azure and stuff like that. But usually, as long as you have a representative icon and like the positional relationship between like offices and stuff like that, they don't criticize you for not having super large amounts of detail, especially things like VLAN. In fact, they would probably ask that not be on there. So that's one way to consider this.
And I would apply the more you show, the more questions you're going to get, right? So we had a client who gave us in preparation for an assessment very complicated, very detailed diagram. It was really hard to understand, and we said, this, you should not bring this to an assessor, right? You will spend more time than you want trying to explain it. So starting small and simple, I think, is a better approach.
Awesome. Well, Stephen, Thomas, I know that was a lot to go through. Seems like we can go on hours and hours and hours, and we simply don't have the time.
Could do that. Chronic yapper.
And as we know, 48 CFR is on the docket. CMMC is up here. Those who are trying to get prepared are also now running out of time. Thank you for joining me. For anyone who asked a question that we didn't get to, we'll try and have someone from our teams reach out to answer it for you. You can find IntelliGRC and Abacode at the links on the screen. And thank you for joining us.
Bye, everybody.